I never thought my quiet life could be shattered until he walked into the room. My heart raced as his gaze lingered. Was it guilt or something deeper? This can't happen, I told myself, but the spark between us was undeniable. What happens when temptation threatens to ruin everything? Where my husband left for his business trip, I thought it would be just another quiet week, but what unfolded in his absence changed everything. What happens when a forbidden connection threatens to destroy everything you thought you knew? Stick around, subscribe for more captivating stories, and I never imagined myself saying this, but the moment my husband closed the door behind him for his business trip, my world shifted in a way I'll never forget. The sound of the lock clicking into place was both a relief and a reminder. It was another week of solitude ahead, a week where I could move freely without the weight of someone's expectations tethering me. Yet, as much as I relished the calm, it wasn't long before the silence became suffocating. I had always prided myself on being the perfect wife, or at least the image of one. Stephen and I had built a life that most would envy. An elegant home, lavish vacations, and a social circle that validated our every move. But beneath the polished exterior was a relationship that had grown cold, mechanical, and devoid of passion. Stephen's father, Richard, had moved in with us 6 months ago. It wasn't something either of us had planned. After his wife passed away unexpectedly, the once robust and self-sufficient man had been reduced to a shell of himself. Stephen, being the ever-dutiful son, insisted we take him in to ensure he wasn't alone in his grief. At first, I resented the intrusion. Richard was a constant reminder of how our lives had been upended, how our marriage was now more about responsibilities than joy. But as time passed, I found myself drawn to him in a way I couldn't quite understand. Maybe it was his quiet strength, or the way he spoke about his late wife with such reverence. He was a man of depth, a stark contrast to Stephen, whose world revolved around business deals and spreadsheets. That evening, after Stephen left, I wandered into the kitchen. The house felt bigger, emptier. I poured myself a glass of wine and leaned against the counter, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. The faint sound of footsteps startled me, and I turned to see Richard standing in the doorway. "Sorry," he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "I didn't mean to startle you." "It's fine," I replied, setting my glass down. "I didn't hear you come down." He stepped into the light, and for the first time I noticed how tired he looked. His gray hair was slightly disheveled, and his shirt hung loosely on his lean frame. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, held an intensity that made my heart skip. "Couldn't sleep," he said, simply shrugging. "Join the club," I muttered, motioning toward the wine bottle. "Care for a glass?" He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Why not?" I poured him a glass, and we sat at the island in silence, the only sound the occasional clink of glass against marble. There was a strange comfort in his presence, a quiet companionship that I hadn't realized I'd been craving. "Stephen works too hard," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked at him, surprised. "That's just who he is. He's always been like that." Richard sighed, swirling the wine in his glass. "It's not a life. I should know. I spent years chasing success, and for what? I missed so much. Time with family, moments that matter." There was a vulnerability in his tone that caught me off guard. I wanted to respond, but no words came. Instead, I reached for my glass, letting the wine burn a path down my throat. "You deserve more," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "I see how lonely you are. You don't have to pretend around me." A lump formed in my throat, and I looked away, focusing on the dark red liquid in my glass. "It's not that simple," I whispered. Nothing ever is, he replied, his voice low. But that doesn't mean it's right. The air between us grew heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. I felt his eyes on me, studying me, waiting for me to say something. Anything that would acknowledge the truth we both knew but dared not speak. Finally, I stood, breaking the spell. I should head to bed, I said, my voice unsteady. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me as I turned to leave. Good night, Emma. Good night, Richard. As I climbed the stairs, my mind raced. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into his words, his tone, but deep down I knew something had shifted, and for the first time in years, The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The house was quiet save for the faint rustling of trees outside. I pulled on my robe and padded downstairs to make coffee, only to find Richard already seated at the kitchen table, a steaming mug in his hands. Good morning, he greeted, his tone warm but subdued. Morning, I replied, surprised to see him up so early. I didn't hear you come down. I'm always an early riser, he said, offering a faint smile. Old habits die hard. I busied myself with the coffee machine, acutely aware of his presence. The events of the previous night lingered in my mind, though I couldn't decide whether they were real or imagined. Had he truly been trying to connect, or was it my own loneliness projecting meaning onto a simple conversation? I hope I didn't keep you up last night, he said, breaking the silence. I turned, coffee in hand. Not at all. I think I slept better than I have in weeks, actually. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's good. You deserve some peace. We fell into a comfortable silence, sipping our drinks as the morning sunlight filtered through the windows. For a moment, it felt as though we were the only two people in the world. A strange, almost forbidden intimacy that neither of us acknowledged aloud. As the day wore on, I found myself gravitating toward him. Whether it was offering to make lunch or asking his opinion on the new landscaping project Stephen had been planning, I sought reasons to linger in his presence. He seemed to notice but said nothing, his quiet demeanor making it easy to pretend our growing connection was innocent. It wasn't until later that afternoon, as we were tending to the garden, that I felt the first crack in the fragile barrier we'd built. You've got dirt on your face, Richard said, gesturing toward my cheek with a faint smirk. I laughed, brushing at my face with the back of my hand. Better? Not quite. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently wipe away the smudge. His fingers lingered for just a moment too long, his touch warm against my skin. My breath caught, and I looked up at him, my heart pounding. Thanks, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move, his eyes locked on mine. The moment stretched, the air between us heavy with something neither of us dared name. Then, as quickly as it had come, the spell was broken. He stepped back, clearing his throat. Sorry, he said, his voice gruff. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You didn't, I replied, though the words felt insufficient. I wanted to say more, to acknowledge the unspoken tension that had been building between us, but I didn't. I couldn't. The days that followed were a careful dance of avoidance and closeness. We found ourselves spending more time together, cooking meals, watching old movies, even sharing stories about our lives before Stephen. Yet, for all the moments we shared, there was an unspoken agreement to keep our interactions just shy of crossing a line. But the line was there, always present, always tempting. It was on the fourth evening that everything came to a head. I had spent the day running errands and returned home to find Richard in the living room, flipping through a photo album. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening. Hey, he said, setting the album aside. How was your day? Daisy, I replied, kicking off my shoes and sinking into the chair opposite him. What about you? Just reminiscing, he said, gesturing to the album. Sometimes it's nice to look back. I hesitated before leaning forward. May I? He slid the album across the coffee table, and I opened it, my eyes scanning the pages. The photos were a mix of old family vacations, candid moments, and portraits of a younger Richard and his late wife. There was a warmth in those images, a love that was almost palpable. She was beautiful, I said, my voice soft. He was, he agreed, his gaze distant. She was everything. The raw emotion in his tone caught me off guard, and I looked up to find him watching me. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a longing that mirrored my own. In that moment, I felt a pull stronger than anything I'd ever experienced. "Richard," I began, my voice trembling. He leaned forward, his hand covering mine. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I met his gaze, my heart racing. "We should stop," he said, though his hand remained on mine. "I know," I whispered, though I made no move to pull away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with the weight of everything we weren't saying. Then, slowly, he withdrew his hand, his expression pained. "This isn't fair to you," he said, his voice thick, "or to Stephen." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I don't think I've felt this alive in years," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He looked at me, his expression a mix of longing and anguish. "Neither have I." The confession hung between us, a fragile truth that neither of us was ready to face. Without another word, he stood and left the room, leaving me alone with the echoes of what could never be. That night I lay awake in bed, my mind racing. Every moment we'd shared played on a loop, each one a reminder of how close we'd come to crossing the line. I told myself it was for the best, that we'd managed to pull back before things went too far. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. The next morning, I resolved to create some distance. It was the only way to keep my sanity intact. Yet as much as I tried to avoid Richard, the house was too small and our routines too intertwined. By noon, I had run out of excuses to stay in my room and decided to take lunch out onto the patio. Richard was already there, a book resting on his lap, though he didn't seem to be reading it. He looked up when he saw me, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Good timing," he said, setting the book aside. "I was just about to make a sandwich. Can I get you something?" "I'm fine," I replied, though my stomach betrayed me with a quiet grumble. He smirked. "I'll take that as a yes." I watched as he went inside, his movements deliberate, unhurried. When he returned with 2 plates, he set one in front of me and took the chair across the table. I tried to focus on the food, but his presence was impossible to ignore. "I was thinking of taking a walk later," he said casually. "The weather's perfect. Care to join me?" I hesitated, my instincts warning me against spending more time alone with him. But the look in his eyes, hopeful, almost boyish, made it impossible to refuse. "Sure," I said finally. "A walk sounds nice." The trail near our house wound through a quiet stretch of woods, the canopy of trees providing a cool, dappled shade. We walked in silence for a while, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filling the gaps. I felt myself relaxing, the tension of the past few days easing with each step. "I used to walk with Margaret here," Richard said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. She loved this trail. I glanced at him, surprised by the mention of his late wife. He rarely spoke of her, at least not in detail. "You must miss her a lot," I said gently. "Every day," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "But lately, I've been wondering if it's possible to miss someone and still move forward." His words hung in the air, their meaning unmistakable. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep walking, my steps steady even as my thoughts spun. "Do you think that's wrong?" he asked, his tone almost pleading. I stopped, turning to face him. I think grief is complicated. There's no right or wrong way to feel. He nodded slowly, his expression pensive. You remind me of her, you know. Not in the way you look, but the way you make me feel understood. The admission sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to say something, to tell him he wasn't alone in feeling this connection, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I reached out, my hand brushing his arm. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental, a bridge between everything we couldn't say. Let's keep walking, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves back on the patio. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the air cool and still. Richard poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat in silence, the unspoken tension between us more palpable than ever. I've been thinking, he said, breaking the quiet, about how much I've taken for granted over the years. I turned to him, curiosity and unease mingling in my chest. What do you mean? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I spent so much time chasing success, trying to provide for my family, that I forgot to actually live. Margaret used to tell me to slow down, to enjoy the moment, but I never listened. His voice cracked, and he looked away, his jaw tight. And now she's gone, and I can't help but wonder, how many more moments will I let slip by? The vulnerability in his words was disarming. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him he wasn't alone in feeling that way. But, as I reached out, he turned to me, his eyes searching mine. Emma, he said softly, his voice trembling, I don't know what this is between us, but I can't ignore it anymore. My breath hitched, and I felt a wave of panic and longing crash over me. Richard, we can't. I know, he interrupted, his tone desperate. But that doesn't stop me from wanting to, from feeling alive again when I'm around you. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I shook my head, trying to will away the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. This isn't fair. To Stephen, to you, to me. No, it's not, he agreed. But life isn't fair, is it? It's messy and complicated and full of choices we wish we didn't have to make. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of his words, of the truth we'd both been avoiding, hung heavy in the air. Finally, he reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I can't pretend this doesn't exist. I looked down at our hands, my mind racing. I wanted to pull away, to run from the inevitability of what was unfolding between us. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a part of me I didn't want to acknowledge. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely audible. We take it one moment at a time, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hand. And we don't do anything you're not ready for. His words were a lifeline, a fragile promise that gave me just enough courage to hold on. As the night deepened, we sat there in silence, our hands intertwined. The world around us faded, leaving only the quiet hum of our breathing and the unspoken question of what came next. The following morning, I awoke with a knot in my stomach. The memory of Richard's words, his touch, and the way his eyes seemed to reach into my soul lingered in my mind like a haunting melody. I told myself I could ignore it, that I could bury the feelings that had surfaced. But as I made my way downstairs, the sight of him in the kitchen made my resolve crumble. He was leaning against the counter, stirring a cup of coffee absent-mindedly. The sunlight streaming through the window highlighted the silver strands in his hair, and for a moment, he looked younger, lighter. Good morning, he said, his voice warm but cautious. Morning, I replied, my tone betraying the nerves I couldn't suppress. I made some coffee, he said, gesturing toward the pot. Help yourself. I poured myself a cup, the simple act grounding me, even as the air between us remained thick with unspoken tension. I sat at the table and Richard joined me, his movements slow and deliberate. "I've been thinking about what we talked about last night," he began, his voice measured. I looked up, my heart racing. "Richard, maybe we shouldn't—" "I know," he said, cutting me off gently. "But I also know that pretending it didn't happen isn't going to make it go away." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. He was right. There was no undoing what had been said, no erasing the feelings that had been laid bare. And yet, acknowledging them felt like stepping onto a precipice, unsure of whether I'd fall or find solid ground. "We can't change how we feel," he continued, his gaze steady, "but we can choose what we do about it." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The line between feeling and action felt so thin, so fragile. One wrong step and everything could The rest of the day passed in a blur. I threw myself into chores, desperate for distraction, but every time I thought I'd found a rhythm, Richard's presence would pull me back. Whether it was a shared glance across the room or the sound of his voice as he spoke to me about the most mundane things. By the time evening came, I was emotionally exhausted. I retreated to my room, telling myself I needed an early night, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the dark, my thoughts racing, my heart aching with a longing I couldn't shake. A soft knock on my door startled me, and I sat up, my pulse quickening. "Come in," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open and Richard stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He hesitated at the threshold, as if unsure whether to proceed. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. I couldn't sleep." I gestured for him to sit, and he crossed the room, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. "I didn't mean to complicate things," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "But I also can't pretend I don't feel this way." "Neither can I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "Then what do we do, Emma?" The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me. I reached out, my hand brushing his. The contact sent a jolt through me, and for a moment I thought I might pull away. But then he covered my hand with his touch warm and steady. "We figure it out," I said, my voice trembling. "One moment at a time." His eyes softened and he gave a small nod. "One moment at a time." Without thinking, I leaned toward him, my heart pounding as our faces drew closer. His breath mingled with mine, and for a fleeting moment the world seemed to fall away. Then his lips brushed mine, soft and hesitant, as if he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, and I felt myself melt into him, the weight of my doubts and fears dissolving in his embrace. His hands cupped my face, his touch gentle but firm, as if he was afraid I might disappear. My fingers tangled in his hair, and I marveled at how right it felt, despite everything. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. "Emma," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to hurt you. Or Stephen." "I know," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "But right now, this feels inevitable." He pulled back slightly, his gaze locking onto mine. "We have to be careful." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what careful looked like anymore. The line we'd been trying so hard not to cross was behind us now, and there was no going back. For the rest of the night, we stayed there, holding each other in the dark. Neither of us spoke, the silence saying more than words ever could. It was a moment of connection, of vulnerability, of something neither of us could fully name. But as the first light of dawn crept through the window, I felt the weight of reality settle over me. What had begun as a quiet longing had become something far more dangerous, and as much as I wanted to hold on to the fleeting happiness I'd found in Richard's arms, I knew the question wasn't if we'd face the consequences of our actions, but when. The next morning brought a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. As the sunlight streamed into my room, the events of the night before felt like a dream, but the warmth of Richard's touch, the way his lips had lingered on mine, was too vivid to be anything but real. My heart wrestled with the implications as I got dressed, preparing to face him again. I took a deep breath before heading downstairs. The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the air, and I found Richard at the table, flipping through the newspaper. He looked up as I entered, his expression a careful mask, but his eyes betrayed him, a flicker of something tender passing through them. "Good morning," he said, his voice measured. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. The memory of last night lingered between us, unspoken but palpable. "I made coffee," he offered. "There's some toast, too, if you're hungry." "Thanks," I said, pouring myself a cup and taking a seat across from him. We sat in silence, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. Finally, he set the paper down, his gaze meeting mine. "Emma, about last night." I held up a hand, cutting him off. "We don't have to talk about it." "But we do," he insisted. "I need to know how you feel, if this, whatever this is, was a mistake." His words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. "It wasn't a mistake," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But that doesn't mean it was right." He nodded, his expression clouded with guilt. "I don't want to hurt you or Stephen, but I also can't pretend this didn't happen." "Neither can I admitted. "But we have to be careful. It can't get out of hand." He reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. "I'll follow your lead, Emma. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." His sincerity was both comforting and devastating. I wanted to believe we could navigate this, that we could keep whatever was between us contained. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. We avoided being alone together, each of us retreating to separate corners of the house. I busied myself with cleaning and errands, anything to keep my mind occupied, but no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts always returned to him, to the way he'd held me, the way he'd looked at me, as if I were the only thing in the world that mattered. By evening, the tension was unbearable. I found myself standing outside his door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't know what I was going to say, only that I needed to see him. Before I could knock, the door opened, and there he was, his expression mirroring my own. Emma," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. I entered the room, my heart pounding. He closed the door behind me, and for a moment we simply stood there, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither can I admitted, tears pricking at my eyes. "But this is wrong, Richard. No matter how it feels, it's wrong." He stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on my arms. "I know. But what am I supposed to do with these feelings? Ignore them? Pretend they don't exist?" "I don't know," I said, my voice cracking. "I don't have the answers." He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. "I don't want to make your life harder, Emma, but I can't stand the thought of losing you." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me. I leaned into him, my forehead resting against his chest. "I'm scared, Richard. I don't want to hurt Stephen, but I don't know how to stop." He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." The days that followed were a delicate dance. We stole moments where we could, a lingering touch, a whispered conversation when no one was around. Each interaction felt like a lifeline, a brief reprieve from the weight of our guilt. But as much as we tried to keep our feelings contained, the cracks were beginning to show. It was during one of these stolen moments that things came to a head. We were in the garden, tending to the flowers Stephen had planted the previous spring. The sun was warm on our backs, and the scent of lavender filled the air. I was crouched near a row of roses, my focus on trimming the overgrown branches, when I felt Richard's presence behind me. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice low. I turned, startled to find him so close. "I think I've got it," I said, though my hands trembled slightly as I spoke. He crouched beside me, his hand brushing mine as he reached for the shears. You're shaking," he observed, his gaze fixed on me. "It's nothing," I said quickly, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. He said softly, his hand resting lightly on my knee. "You don't have to do this alone." His touch sent a jolt through me, and I looked away, my breath catching. "We shouldn't be doing this, Richard." "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I can't seem to stop." Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. We sprang apart, panic flashing in his eyes. "It's Stephen," I whispered, my heart racing. Richard stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Go inside," he said quickly. "I'll handle it." I nodded, scrambling to my feet and hurrying into the house. From the window, I watched as Stephen stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable. He exchanged a few words with Richard, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. When Stephen finally came inside, he looked tired but pleased to be home. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, his demeanor warm and casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, as I lay in bed beside Stephen, my mind raced. The guilt I'd been trying so hard to suppress threatened to consume me, and I couldn't help but wonder if he knew, if he suspected. The walls I'd built to contain my secret were crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. I avoided Stephen's gaze as we went through the motions of our morning routine. Every small gesture, pouring coffee, exchanging casual greetings, felt heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Richard, too, seemed quieter than usual, his presence subdued as he busied himself in the garden. I knew it was only a matter of time before the delicate balance we'd been maintaining tipped over. And as much as I wanted to believe we could keep everything hidden, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. Stephen left for the office mid-morning, promising to be back in the evening. The moment the front door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But the relief was short-lived. Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "Emma," he said softly, "we need to talk." I nodded, following him into the living room. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the distance between us a stark contrast to the intimacy we'd shared just days ago. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he began, his voice steady but strained. "It's not fair to you, to Stephen, or to myself." "I know," I replied, my throat tight. "But what are we supposed to do, Richard? What's the right answer?" He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "The right answer would have been to stop this before it started. But now, I don't know." The vulnerability in his words cut deep. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but I held back, afraid of where that path would lead. "Maybe we need some space," I suggested, though the thought filled me with dread. "At least until we figure out what this is." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "If that's what you need, I'll respect it, but I want you to know that I care about you, Emma, more than I should." Tears welled in my eyes, and I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The thought of losing him, of losing the connection we'd built, was almost too much to bear, but I knew it was the only way to preserve what little stability we had left. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I kept myself busy with housework, anything to keep my mind off the ache in my chest. Richard stayed in his room, the distance between us growing with each passing hour. That evening, when Stephen returned, he seemed unusually cheerful. He brought takeout from our favorite restaurant, and we ate together in the dining room, the sound of our conversation filling the space that had felt so empty just hours before. "You'd been quiet lately," Stephen said, his tone light but probing. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, nodding. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a busy week." He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "Well, let me know if there's anything I can do. I don't want you taking on too much." "I'm fine," I assured him, though the words felt hollow. "Really?" After dinner, Stephen retreated to his office to catch up on work. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the flickering light of the television, but barely registering the images. My thoughts were consumed by Richard, by the way he made me feel, and the undeniable pull that threatened to unravel everything. I was startled out of my reverie by the sound of footsteps. Richard stood in the doorway, his expression guarded. He glanced toward Stephen's office, then back at me. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. "Stephen's still awake." "I know," he said, stepping into the room. "But I needed to see you." I rose from the couch, crossing my arms over my chest. "Richard, we agreed." "I know what we agreed," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "But I can't ignore this, Emma. I've tried, and it's tearing me apart." His words sent a jolt through me, and I felt my resolve begin to falter. "What do you want me to say, Richard? That I feel the same? That I'm just as torn?" "Maybe I do," he said, stepping closer. "Or maybe I just need to know I'm not the only one who can't stop thinking about this." I looked away, my heart pounding. "Of course you're not the only one. But that doesn't make it right." "No, it doesn't," he admitted, his voice softening. "But it doesn't make it any less real, either." The silence between us was deafening, the weight of our unspoken feelings threatening to crush me. Finally, I took a step back, putting distance between us. "We can't keep doing this, Richard," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not fair to anyone." He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right, but that doesn't mean it'll be easy." "No," I agreed, "it won't." He lingered for a moment, his gaze searching mine. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the chaos of my thoughts. As I sat back down on the couch, the gravity of the situation hit me with full force. I had thought I could control this, that I could compartmentalize my feelings and maintain some semblance of normalcy. But I was wrong. The line we'd been trying so hard to preserve was gone, and there was no undoing the damage. All that remained was the question of what came next and whether we could survive the fallout. The next day, the weight of what had unfolded in the living room lingered with me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I tried to bury myself in the mundane, cleaning, organizing, even attempting to bake, though I wasn't much of a baker. But no matter what I did, my mind kept drifting back to Richard, his words, his presence, the way his voice had trembled when he admitted he couldn't ignore his feelings. By mid-afternoon, the house was still and quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and whisper. I found myself staring at the clock, willing time to pass faster. Stephen had left for the office, promising to be home late. That left me alone with Richard and the unspoken tension between us. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The trail near our house had always been a place of solace for me, a refuge when life felt overwhelming. As I stepped onto the path, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth greeted me, grounding me in the moment. But as I rounded a bend, I saw him. Richard was sitting on a fallen log, his head bowed and his hands clasped between his knees. He looked lost in thought, his posture heavy with an invisible burden. He didn't notice me at first, and for a brief moment, I considered turning back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet resignation, as if he'd been expecting me. "Hey," he said softly. "Hi." My voice sounded small, even to me. "Didn't expect to see you out here," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I needed some air," I replied, stepping closer. "What about you?" He gestured to the log beside him, inviting me to sit. "Just thinking." I hesitated for a moment before taking a seat, the space between us both comforting and agonizing. We sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the forest filling the gaps in our conversation. "I've been trying to figure out where we go from here," he said finally, his voice low. "How to fix this." "Can it be fixed?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way, Emma. And I don't think you can either." His honesty was both a balm and a blow. I turned to him, tears pricking at my eyes. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Richard, especially not Stephen. But every time I try to push these feelings away, they come back stronger." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and regret. "I wish things were different. I wish I'd met you at another time, another place. But wishing doesn't change anything, does it?" "No," I whispered, my throat tight. "It doesn't." The air between us grew heavy, the weight of our shared confession settling over us like a shroud. I wanted to reach out to touch him, but I knew that doing so would only make things worse. Instead, I stood, brushing dirt from my hand. "I should go," I said, my voice unsteady. He nodded, though his expression was pained. "Take care, Emma." I walked away, my steps unsteady on the uneven path. But even as I put distance between us, I could feel his gaze on me, a reminder of everything we'd shared and everything we couldn't have. When I returned home, the house felt emptier than ever. I made myself a cup of tea and curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The hours crawled by, and when Stephen finally came home, his cheerful demeanor only deepened my guilt. "You look tired," he said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, nodding. "Just a long day." He kissed my forehead, his touch gentle but distant. "Well, don't worry about dinner. I'll order something. Take it easy tonight." I watched as he disappeared into the kitchen, my chest tightening. Stephen had always been attentive in his own way, but there was a distance between us now that I couldn't ignore, a chasm that had grown wider with each passing day. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, the weight of my choices pressed down on me like a physical burden. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess of regret and longing, and, for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine a life without secrets. A life where I didn't have to choose between the man I loved and the man I couldn't stop thinking about. The following days passed in a blur. I avoided Richard as much as possible, though it was impossible to avoid him entirely. Each interaction was fraught with tension, our words carefully chosen to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But beneath the surface, the undercurrent of our connection remained, a silent reminder of everything we'd tried. It wasn't until Stephen announced he had another business trip coming up that the fragile balance we'd maintained began to unravel. He told us over dinner, his tone casual, as if it were just another item on his to-do list. "It's only for a few days," he said, glancing between us. "I'll be back before the weekend." Richard and I exchanged a brief glance, the implications of his absence hanging heavy in the air. I forced a smile, nodding. "We'll manage." Stephen's departure felt like a breaking point. The house, already filled with tension, became a pressure cooker, every moment charged with unspoken words and forbidden desires. And as much as I tried to stay strong, the pull toward Richard was impossible to resist. It was on the second evening of Stephen's trip that everything came to a head. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Richard appeared in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. "Emma," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." I set down the dish I was holding, my hands trembling. "About what?" "You know what," he said, stepping closer. "We can't keep doing this, dancing around it, pretending it doesn't exist." "I know," I whispered, my heart pounding, "but I don't know how to stop." He closed the distance between us, his hands resting lightly on my arms. "Maybe we don't." The words sent a jolt through me, a mix of fear and exhilaration. I looked up at him, my breath catching as his gaze held mine. "Virgil, we can't." But before I could finish, he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative as if he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But when I didn't, the kiss deepened, his hand sliding up to cut my face. I melted into him, the weight of my guilt and fear momentarily forgotten in the heat of the moment. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to hide anymore, Emma, but I'll follow your lead. Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Tears streamed down my face as I nodded, my heart torn in two. "I don't know what to do, Richard. I don't know." He pulled me into his arms, holding me close. "We'll figure it out together." But as I clung to him, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of a cliff, and that the fall was inevitable. The kiss lingered in my mind long after Richard had gone to bed. I sat alone in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. My hands trembled as I replayed the moment in my head. His touch, his words, the undeniable pull between us. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, more. I knew we were teetering on the edge of something that could destroy us both, and yet a part of me couldn't bring myself to stop. It wasn't just the thrill of forbidden affection. It was the way he made me feel seen, understood, in a way I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, I woke with a heavy heart. Stephen's absence had always been a relief in the past, giving me space to breathe. But now, it felt like a double-edged sword, his distance granting Richard and me more freedom than we could handle. I avoided Richard for most of the day, finding excuses to stay busy and out of his way. But by late afternoon, I found myself in the garden, pruning the rose bushes. The repetitive motion was soothing, a temporary reprieve from the storm raging in my mind. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear Richard approach. It wasn't until his shadow fell over me that I realized he was there. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly. I straightened, brushing dirt from my hands. "I'm just trying to keep busy." He nodded, though his expression was tinged with sadness. "Emma, we can't keep running from this, from each other." I looked away, my chest tightening. "I don't know what you want me to say, Richard. That I'm scared? That I feel like I'm losing myself?" He stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't want you to feel like this is taking something from you. If anything, it's given me a part of myself I thought I'd lost." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned to him, tears welling in my eyes. "But at what cost? What happens if Stephen finds out? What happens if we ruin everything?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't have all the answers, Emma, but I know that what I feel for you is real, and I think it's worth fighting for." The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me. I wanted to believe him, to believe that this connection we shared could exist without tearing everything else apart. but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. I need time, I said finally, my voice trembling. I need to figure out what I want, what I can live with. He nodded, his expression pained but understanding. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. I watched as he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. The sight filled me with a mix of relief and regret, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like a physical burden. That night, as I lay in bed, the silence of the house felt deafening. I tossed and turned, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's face, heard his words, felt his touch. The intensity of it all was suffocating. Unable to sleep, I got up and wandered into the living room. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the furniture. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I was looking for. The sound of footsteps startled me, and I turned to see Richard standing in the doorway. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked as restless as I felt. Couldn't sleep? He asked. I shook my head, my heart pounding. No. He hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. Neither could. We stood there in silence, the air between us charged with unspoken tension. I could feel the pull again, that magnetic force that seemed to draw us together no matter how hard we tried to resist. Richard, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. We can't keep doing this. I know, he said, his tone heavy with regret, but I can't seem to stop. His honesty sent a shiver through me, and I looked away, tears pricking at my eyes. I don't want to hurt anyone. Neither do I, he said, stepping closer. But I can't ignore what I feel for you, Emma. I've tried, and it's impossible. His words broke down the last of my defenses. Before I could stop myself, I reached out, my hand brushing his. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I saw the same spark in his eyes. We're going to ruin everything, I said, my voice trembling. Maybe, he replied. But what if we don't? The question hung in the air, daring me to believe in the possibility of something more. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine a life where we didn't have to hide, where we didn't have to pretend. Before I could think better of it, I closed the distance between us, my lips finding his in the dim light. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were testing the boundaries of what was possible. But as the moment deepened, all thoughts of restraint vanished. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his hands cradling my face. What happens now? I whispered. We figure it out, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. One step at a time. I nodded, though the fear in my chest remained. The line we'd crossed was far behind us now, and there was no turning back. All that was left was the uncertain path ahead, and the hope that we could navigate it without losing ourselves in the process. The morning after our kiss felt surreal. The house was bathed in golden sunlight, but the brightness only seemed to highlight the heaviness in my chest. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and staring out the window. My mind replayed the events of the night before, the way Richard had looked at me, his touch, the way it had felt so right and so wrong at the same time. Richard entered the kitchen, his steps quieter than usual. He hesitated for a moment before grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting across from me. The silence between us was thick, but it wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind that held 1,000 unspoken words. We need to talk, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes searching mine. I know. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Last night, it can't happen again. His expression faltered, a flicker of pain crossing his face. I understand, he said, though his tone betrayed the struggle behind his words. But Emma, I don't regret it. Not for a second. I looked away, tears stinging my eyes. That's the problem, Richard. Neither do I. The admission hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. Then why are we punishing ourselves for something that feels so inevitable? Because it's not just about us, I said, my voice trembling. Stephen, he trusts us. He trusts you. How can we betray him like this? Richard sighed, his shoulders slumping. I've asked myself the same question 100 times, and every time I come back to the same answer. Because what I feel for you is real, and I don't think I can walk away from that. His words cut through me like a knife, both comforting and devastating. I wanted to believe we could make sense of this, that we could find a way to navigate the impossible. But deep down, I knew the road we were on could only lead to heartache. The day passed in a haze. I avoided Stephen's calls, unable to muster the energy to feign normalcy. Instead, I buried myself in chores, scrubbing and organizing as if I could somehow cleanse the guilt that clung to me like a second skin. By the time evening rolled around, the tension in the house had reached a breaking point. I was in the living room, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, when Richard appeared in the doorway. His presence sent a shiver through me, the intensity in his gaze impossible to ignore. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone measured. I set my phone down, nodding. Of course. He crossed the room, sitting beside me on the couch. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with everything we were afraid to say. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice soft. "About Stephen, about trust. And you're right. It's not fair to him. He deserves better than this." I looked at him, my heart aching at the pain in his expression. "So what do we do, Richard? How do we move forward?" He hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Maybe we need to create some distance. For a while, at least." The suggestion hit me like a punch to the gut, but I knew he was right. "You mean avoid each other?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "I think it's the only way to keep from crossing the line again, for Stephen's sake and for ours." The thought of pulling away from him felt unbearable, but I forced myself to nod. "If that's what it takes, then that's what we'll do." Richard's gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing mine. "I'm sorry, Emma, for putting you in this position, for everything." Tears welled in my eyes, and I shook my head. "Don't apologize, Richard. This isn't just on you. I'm as much a part of this as you are." We sat there for a long moment, the unspoken emotions between us threatening to spill over. Finally, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Good night, Emma," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Good night," I replied, my voice barely audible. The days that followed were excruciating. Richard and I avoided each other as much as possible, our interactions reduced to curt nods and brief exchanges. The silence in the house was deafening, the weight of our unspoken connection pressing down on me like a physical burden. Stephen returned from his trip a few days later, his usual cheerfulness a stark contrast to the tension that lingered between Richard and me. I did my best to act normal, to play the role of the attentive wife, but every time I caught Richard's gaze, my resolve faltered. It wasn't until Stephen suggested a family dinner that the facade began to crack. We sat around the table, the sound of clinking silverware and casual conversation filling the room. But beneath the surface, the tension between Richard and me was impossible to ignore. "Dad, you've been quiet," Stephen said, his tone light but curious. "Everything okay?" Richard hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. "Just tired," he said finally. "Nothing to worry about." Stephen nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me, his brow furrowed slightly. "What about you, Emma?" he asked. "You've seemed distant lately." My heart skipped a beat and I forced a smile. "Just busy," I said quickly. "You know how it is." He nodded, though the concern in his expression didn't fade. I avoided his gaze, focusing on my plate as the rest of the meal passed in a blur. That night, as Stephen worked in his office, I found myself standing outside Richard's door. I knew I shouldn't be there, that I should turn around and walk away, but the pull was too strong to ignore. I knocked softly, my heart pounding in my chest. The door opened a moment later, and Richard stood before me, his expression a mix of surprise and longing. "Emma," he said, his voice low. "What are you doing here?" "I don't know," I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. I can't do this anymore." He stepped aside, letting me in. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows on the walls. I stood there, my hands trembling, as he closed the door behind me. "Talk to me," he said, his tone gentle but insistent. "What's going on?" I looked at him, my emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine, Richard. It's not. I feel like I'm losing my mind." He stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on my arms. "You're not alone in this, Emma. I feel it too. Every moment we're apart, it's like a part of me is missing." Tears streamed down my face, and I shook my head. "What are we going to do, Richard? How do we fix this?" He pulled me into his arms, holding me close. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Together." But as I clung to him, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were spiraling toward something neither of us could control, and that the consequences would be devastating. The morning after felt surreal, as though the events of the previous night had been a vivid dream. But the lingering sensation of Richard's touch, the taste of his kiss, reminded me that it was all too real. I lay in bed longer than usual, unwilling to face the day and the inevitable consequences of our actions. When I finally mustered the courage to leave my room, I found Richard in the kitchen. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee, his movements deliberate but subdued. He looked up when he heard me, his expression a mix of relief and trepidation. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft. "Good morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. The air between us was heavy with the weight of everything that had passed between us. I busied myself with making coffee, avoiding his gaze as I tried to steady my racing thoughts. "Did you sleep well?" he asked after a moment. I turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Do you really want to have small talk right now?" He sighed, setting his cup down. "No, but I don't know how else to start." I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. "Then don't. Let's just figure this out." The months that followed Richard's departure brought a strange sense of quiet to the house. It was a silence not just of sound, but of emotional weight. A pause after the storm. The tension that had once filled every corner of my life began to dissipate, leaving behind a mix of relief and emptiness. Stephen and I tried to rebuild, though it felt more like patching cracks in a foundation that had already begun to crumble. He became more attentive, asking questions about my day and suggesting weekend getaways to reconnect. I played along, grateful for his efforts, but the truth lingered between us like a ghost. We both knew something was broken, something that couldn't be undone. One evening, as we sat together on the patio, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Stephen broke the silence. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. The question startled me, though I had asked myself the same thing countless times. Why would you ask that? He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I don't know if we're making each other happy anymore. And I think that's what marriage is supposed to be about, choosing happiness together." His words struck a chord deep within me. For years, I had convinced myself that marriage was about endurance, about weathering storms no matter how relentless. But maybe he was right. Maybe love was a choice, and sometimes The hardest choice was knowing when to let go. I think about it sometimes, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But it's not an easy decision. Stephen turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. It's not. But maybe it's time we started being honest with each other. Really honest. For the first time in what felt like years, we spoke openly, laying bare the fears, doubts, and regrets that had festered between us. There were tears and apologies, but there was also an undeniable sense of clarity. By the end of the conversation, we both knew what had to be done. A few weeks later, Stephen and I sat in the living room, signing the final papers that would dissolve our marriage. The process was amicable, even tender. We weren't ending things out of anger or betrayal, but out of the understanding that we were better apart than together. As I packed my belongings and prepared to move into a small apartment across town, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me to this moment, the mistakes, the pain, and the forbidden connection with Richard. They were all part of a journey that had forced me to confront the truth about myself and my life. One day, as I unpacked boxes in my new place, I found a small envelope tucked between some books. Inside was a note from Richard, written in his familiar, steady handwriting. I hope this finds you well. I wanted you to know that, despite everything, I'm grateful for the moments we shared. They were complicated and imperfect, but they were real. You taught me how to feel again, and for that, I'll always be thankful. Be happy, Emma. You deserve it. Tears filled my eyes as I folded the note and placed it in a drawer. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see Richard again, but his words brought a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Standing in my small garden that evening, I watched the roses bloom, their petals vibrant against the fading light. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward, and for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope for what might come next.